Welcome everyone to our monthly review. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Wendy Powell, who is an associate professor at Tilburg University. And Wendy is an expert in virtual reality and healthcare. She has worked in rehabilitation, has done a PhD in virtual reality, and has more than 15 years experience in applying virtual reality to healthcare. And so it's my pleasure today to welcome Wendy and get a nice summary of her expertise in virtual reality and healthcare in her talk, The Good, the Bad and the Better, Risks and Opportunities in Virtual Healthcare. And before we start, just a heads up. So this talk will be recorded. So if you don't want to be on the recorded video, please keep your webcams and your microphones disabled. Thank you very much. And now, Wendy, please go ahead with your talk.
Okay, thanks, Christoph. I'm really happy to be here and to see one or two of you and the rest of you welcome. I'm going to give a bit of an overview. I know I've only got 15 minutes and this is a huge topic. And so I'm really just going to try and stimulate some thinking rather than spend lots of time presenting all my research and giving you too much information, I hope. So very briefly, if I can find my moving on my screen, I apparently can't go to my next slide. Yes, I can. There we go. Very briefly, as Christoph has mentioned, I've got a very multidisciplinary background. My PhD is in virtual reality with an emphasis on healthcare, but I'm also a qualified chiropractor, and I've also got a second degree in computer science. I spent about the last 15 years researching and teaching in how humans interact with immersive systems, and particularly looking at VR in healthcare. I'm currently working in the Netherlands, Tilburg University. I'm an IEEE senior member and VR technical expert, so I'm a very technical person, and I'm also on the board of the International Society for Virtual Rehabilitation, so I've got a clinical side as well. And I've written a fair amount in this field, and particularly in the interface between the humans and the immersive systems and how they interact with those systems. So that's kind of my rather odd background, quite technical, but also quite clinical, which is why I come with a slightly different perspective sometimes on this problem. So I want to briefly talk about why we use VR for health, some, and only some of the issues with VR, because I certainly can't cover all of them, and then a little bit of a sort of thinking approach to how we can improve VR health applications. So again, this is mostly to stimulate your thinking rather than to just give you a huge tool set in order to make everything better. That's not so simple. So why do we use VR in healthcare? Which is a really good question, and people ask me that. And there are myriad reasons why we might want to, and I'm just going to skim through a couple of those. Firstly, and perhaps most obviously, it's very engaging or distracting. Healthcare, and particularly physical healthcare or procedures, can be painful, uncomfortable, boring, especially if they're repetitive, and VR gives us an opportunity to engage people a little more in a little different way. So it's kind of fun. Importantly, it allows us to give both clinicians and patients feedback, and very dynamically, and often in a way that can be visualised much more easily than if we're just putting them through their paces in a gym, for instance. So we can build that into the systems. It allows safe practice of activities of daily living. There's lots of things that people need to learn to do again, for example, in physical rehabilitation, crossing the road. And those are very difficult to do in a real life setting, quite hard to mimic in any meaningful way in the clinical environment. Virtual reality allows us to recreate quite complex environments and for people to practice some of those activities of daily living in an ecologically valid environment. It's pretty controllable, so we can be quite precise in terms of what sort of dosages or levels of intervention we can give a patient, and we can dynamically change that based on either an individual's needs or their performance at that point, whether it's a cognitive or physical performance. And of course, scientists, clinicians really love data. Data collection is really important for both. Data collection in VR is kind of built for it because we are already monitoring behaviour, responses and system events in order to run the applications. And so it's really very simple to add a layer where we can collect that data and either display it in real time or analyse it offline, both for the clinicians and for the patients. So data collection is kind of a built-in bonus for using VR. So those are some of the reasons why we might use VR for healthcare. But another question I get asked a lot is which areas of healthcare can benefit from VR? And this is a very VR-focused question because we've kind of got a tool and we want to know where we can use it. In a way, that question should be the other way around, or could be the other way around, which is what do we know about healthcare that we've got problems that might be able to be solved by technology? And the answer to that is pretty broad, actually. If you do, as I read around a lot of articles in this area, and I just did a quick sort of summary of some of the articles I've read recently and just created a word cloud of some of the recent things I've read about VR in health. And you can see it covers an awful lot of areas. And this is just a little snapshot of the tip of the iceberg of some of the areas that people are looking at using VR in healthcare. So it's huge. And in a way, the question isn't where can we, but perhaps where should we? What can it do? And how can we then leverage that for better healthcare? I'm not going to give you the answers, but hopefully I'm going to get you thinking about that a little bit. So I'm going to cover just a few of those, just to give you a bit of a background of some of the possibilities. Some of you may be very familiar with this, but some people are quite surprised by some of the areas that VR can be used in healthcare. So one of the most long-standing ones, certainly in research, in clinical research, is upper and lower limb rehabilitation. Physical rehabilitation is a huge problem in the elderly, post-stroke, post-illness, post-surgery, injured military vets. And these two areas take up a huge amount of therapist time. And they are both fairly open or fairly have potential to use VR. Upper limb rehabilitation is perhaps a little further forward on that. We've got things like looking at hand tracking. The top is looking at elite motion. Old one now, we've got better hand tracking available. But looking at things like finger fractionation tasks, so fine movements after stroke, those kind of things, lend themselves very well to VR because of the visual feedback you can get. The lower one, which I don't think is displaying very well on this screen, is actually large-scale cave VR, looking at shoulder rehabilitation, reaching out, picking apples, moving them around. This is a colleague's work in order to increase range of motion in the shoulder. Now, for upper limb rehabilitation, we have the advantage we don't have to have them walk around a space. So as long as we can track their broad movements or get some hand tracking, we can have them sitting or standing, don't have to track them in a space, so we don't have some of the issues of walking around in the space. Lower limb rehabilitation, a little bit more of a challenge, because for the most part, we want people to walk around. We want to get them walking, you have to get them walking, and that can be a problem in VR. In a lot of large scale, and particularly the military rehabilitation centres, we get around this problem using treadmills as interfaces or moving platforms. There are other ways to do it, but typically it's connecting some sort of walking platform into the VR and then giving them an immersive environment with perhaps obstacles or things like traffic coming if they're going to cross a road, and giving them timed tasks. But these require a little bit more hardware and a little bit more technology supervision and setup. So we're finding that this is, whilst it's a promising area and used very widely in military rehabilitation centres, it's less rolled out into smaller clinical settings at the moment because it's got a much larger requirement for specialist equipment. What about other areas? Psychological applications are a very big area for VR. We know from the history of video games that just being immersed even in a game can change how people's emotions, behaviour, both positively and negatively, and this is even more so in immersive VR, and we can leverage that. So, for example, there's a lot of work, Skip Rizzo's team in the University of Southern California do a lot of work with military veterans in post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and there are quite a few groups around the world. This is now being quite widely applied and quite successfully with a whole range of people, not just military veterans, but also, for example, after some of the terrorist attacks, they've been using it for some of the survivors of 9/11, for instance. And so PTSD exposure and treatment is one of the big areas that's really growing in VR. But also, and you'll see this is quite an old image, and I've done that deliberately because this is one of the areas in VR health that's been around for really quite a long time, and that is the treatment of fears and phobias. This particular one is from the Virtual Reality Medical Centre, which is a clinical centre which has been treating fears and phobias in VR for a very long time, certainly more than a decade, and quite successfully, by allowing very controlled environments, exposing them to specific fears in a controlled way under the guidance of a therapist. So the psychological side. But then there's another area which, when I first came across it, was quite surprising to me, and that is of the management of pain, both acute and chronic pain. It kind of makes sense. The early work was, this one here was Hunter Hoffman's work looking at paediatric burn victims, and he found that just the immersive VR, especially interactive VR, not only distracted them from painful procedures, but also reduced the amount of distress and the amount of medication they needed. There's been quite a lot of work done in a whole range of areas since then, including minor surgical procedures, and VR seems to be quite an effective distractor or analgesic. And still, the jury's out on precisely how it works, but fMRI studies do show that there's a reduced activity in the pain centres in the brain while people are interacting with VR. So there's some really interesting potential there. Chronic pain is a little bit different, because chronic pain doesn't just allow one novel exposure, but to manage chronic pain, people who are in pain for a long period of time, we need to know a little bit more about how they respond to repeated exposure. So we don't know enough about that yet. This one on the right is actually an application called Banana Land, and one of my PhD students is working with that. We've already established that patients with chronic pain do respond to VR as a distractor. What we need to know now is whether they can continue using that as a repeated intervention over a prolonged period of time, but quite a promising area. Then another area which particularly interests me is, I keep not being able to click, sorry about that, is phantom limb pain. And this is an area where VR really comes into its own. Phantom pain is when amputees, such as my friend Matthew here, when they lose limbs, Matthew lost all 4 limbs, 95% of them still have sensation in the missing limb, and for most of those people it's pain, and often very severe pain that's very difficult to treat. Motor visualization or mirror therapy can be quite an effective treatment, but motor visualization is difficult for a lot of people, and mirror therapy is completely useless for somebody who doesn't have an intact limb on the other side. And so we need different approaches. So one of the approaches we've been looking at, and so have other teams as well, is looking at ways to track. Here we're using surface EMG, so muscle activity from the residual limb, or tracking the residual limb, and then giving them a visualization of the activities of that limb in virtual reality in order to help them manage pain. And from the clinical groups that are doing this, early results are quite promising that even this strange psychological and physical combined pain seems to be managed quite well using virtual reality. So quite an interesting area to look into. Not forgetting, of course, the application of training and education. I'm not going to go into this in any depth. A couple of examples here. This is one of my students working with molecular visualizations of complex biological molecules. We've got surgical training. This is touch surgery. And this one, probably very relevant right now, one of our applications looking at infection control training using immersive hand tracking. And so lots and lots of areas where it can be used in training and education. So, why aren't we using it all the time for everything? And there are myriad answers for that. Some of them I can't go into, but I am going to look at one small part of that answer, which is there are some problems with VR. Some problems and some surprising things that affect the outcomes. Christoph, I'm going to ask you to keep an eye on my timings, because I've just realised my timings on screen are from when I first screen shared with you, so I have no idea where we are on timings. So
don't worry, keep going.
Give me a hint if we're running behind. Okay, so I'm going to look at some of the issues with VR. The first one, if you've got an interest in VR, I hope that you're aware of, and that is cybersickness. This is one that most people are aware of. A lot of people say to me, but that's not a problem anymore, is it, with new equipment, with the latest advances in technology? Yes, it is still a problem, and the problem is more to do with design than it is to do with technology. So a couple of the issues you might be aware of. One, which we certainly haven't got rid of, the accommodation convergence conflict, and that is essentially that when you wear a VR headset, you're looking and you're focusing on a screen which is just an inch or two from your eyes. But in the virtual world, in the simulation, you're often looking at things that may be several meters away, and the conflict between the two creates a lot of problems like headaches, double vision, eye strain, and so on, and we certainly haven't got rid of that yet. System delay, again, people think is no longer a problem, where you do something and then there's a little bit of a delay before it updates in the system. It's better than it used to be, but it still is a problem. For example, now we're moving on to wireless links, that can be a problem, but also sometimes, again, design issues. It's very easy now, relatively, to make a VR application, very hard to make a good one. One of the common problems is that somebody makes quite a processor-heavy game and then puts it onto smartphone VR, which can't handle it, which means we do then get a lot of lag, and that still is quite a problem, especially for low-end VR. This is a big one, the mismatch between visual and vestibular cues, and by that I mean what we see, we expect all our other senses to match that, and in particular, our inner ear, which picks up rotations and accelerations and is involved in our balance and our detection of movement. In VR, it is really, really common that we see one thing happening. So, for example, we might be moving forwards, but our body is telling us they're stationary. And the conflict between those two, particularly with accelerations and rotations, does create huge problems. Some of the symptoms that you should be aware of: blurred vision, nausea, headache, fatigue, confusion, and this is really important, they don't stop when you take the headset off. If you catch it really early, if you're working with participants, particularly vulnerable patients, the moment there's a hint of cybersickness, the headset should come off. If you persist, symptoms can last for several hours. Certainly in one unforgettable experience I had as a test subject for somebody's VR, lasted for about 24 hours. So you really need to be aware this isn't something that push through it and it'll be fine when you take the headset off. Injuries. Oh, VR is a terrible thing. Lots and lots of potential for injury, and I'm sure you've all laughed at YouTube videos of some of these. A couple of examples, things to think about. The obvious one, it's often tethered. High-end VR is mostly tethered to your computer. When you get carried away or you forget to monitor your participants, there are trip hazards. We flail into objects, you get engaged in, particularly if you want a very engaging, immersive experience, a physical experience. If you've got objects nearby, it's very easy, even with Guardian boundaries, to move past those, to reach out a bit too far and to hit things. I've certainly done it plenty of times. This is an important one that people tend to not think about so much. When VR is engaging, we all do a bit more. I mean, for those of you who play things like Beat Saber, it's really good, gets your heart rate up, you play and it's very engaging, which is often a very good thing. If you're talking about vulnerable patients or patients prone to injury, suddenly that's not such a good thing, and they can very easily injure themselves just by being the very thing we're leveraging VR for, which is its engaging properties, can lead to injury. Pain perception, we've just talked about pain perception, but the very fact that pain is reduced, or our perception of pain is reduced in VR, can lead to injury or to exacerbating injury. If you're engaged and you're not feeling the pain, you won't know when to stop. And particularly, again, in patient populations, this is a problem because they're much more vulnerable to injury. And this one, hilarious, and this source of so many lovely YouTube videos, and I've certainly done this. The more immersive your VR is, the better it gets. More ecologically valid for a patient, more particularly with cognitive impairments or elderly patients, the more likely they are to expect your virtual objects to have physical properties, to lean on them, to sit on a chair, to put something on a table, and that can lead to some quite amusing, but also potentially quite dangerous falls, stumbles, and injuries. So one to be very aware of, particularly when you're making very immersive, very believable scenarios for your patients. So, another area you may not be so aware of, and this is that by its very nature, we have visual and audio information in our VR simulations. We put it there deliberately, we want that. But fewer people are aware that that has a direct effect on people's perception and behaviour. And just a couple of examples. Peripheral cues, and this is some very simple experiments I did with my PhD. When you've got peripheral cues, there might be street lamps, trees, buildings. As people are moving through VR, it actually distorts people's speed perception and changes how they walk. And that may not be what you want when you're trying to do something very specific in rehabilitation. Music, which we put in there because it's nice and it has the immersiveness. Music and sound effects by themselves change emotion and mood, which, fair enough, you might or might not care about that. But changes in mood also affect movement behaviour and people's ability to control their movements. And then the tempo of your audio, if you've got music in the background, alters both the speed and the quality of walking. Something that people are very often not aware about when they just add these things into VR. So, full of problems, and there are many more. So, why do we bother? Should we bother? And I think, yes, we very much should bother, but I think we can do it better. So I want to talk just a little bit on how we can change our thinking and become a little bit more aware of the potential problems and the potential benefits to make better VR health applications. And I'm certainly not going to give you a formula, but maybe a way to think. Firstly, we can look at some of the problems. This one is one that everybody should be aware of and make sure they're doing as a kind of a baseline, reduce the cybersickness. Things like careful placement of your objects of interest, keep them 1 to 3 meters away, reduce the amount of reading, keep it central in the field of view, is really important. This visual vestibular mismatch, which is a really common one in VR, very simple. If you reduce the rotations and accelerations and have steady velocity instead, that makes a huge difference straight away. Narrative design to minimise dissonance, very posh way of basically saying make sure your story fits what you're seeing. So imagine, for example, I experienced a VR experience going around a Roman villa, and I just got passively floated around, and it was really quite nauseating. A slightly different experience where I was on a flying carpet in a VR experience. The narrative was the flying carpet. The visual experience was exactly the same, but because my expectation was to be passively moved, my nausea was much less. So sometimes just having a narrative design that fits the constraints of the way you're moving around VR can make quite a big difference to experience. And most importantly, and I'm not going to go into all of these, there are lots and lots of really good design guidelines now for reducing cybersickness. Please read them and use them. So I'm not going to dwell on that. But more importantly, some of the potential risks, things we now know about VR, we can turn into benefits. And I love something that Professor Pam Kalo said. I don't know if you know Pam Kalo. She's, for a long time, was the director of the Serious Games Institute. And when asked, does VR for health work, she answered, it's like a syringe. It depends on the content you put in it. And I think that absolutely encapsulates it. I often talk about the VR pharmacy. VR has components. They might be good, they might be bad, and people have different needs. And VR is not in itself a means to do good for people, but it has components in it, ingredients in it which can, and understanding how those ingredients work and which ones are important for which tasks and outcomes, that's the job of good VR health design. And we don't know enough yet, we haven't researched this pharmacy well enough, but we are at least starting to realise that these components exist. So we've got hardware and software interactions, and we need to understand those, and we need to understand how that changes people's perception and performance. If we understand those a bit more, we can make better VR. So, for example, looking at some of the musculoskeletal problems, we know that people overexert and engage in VR. So one of the ways we can manage that side effect, and it is a side effect, is to take away some of the competitive elements a little bit. Don't make it too engaging too fast. And then later on, start increasing the variety and challenge so we can manage that overexertion. And we need to do it differently for patients than we do for gamers, for example. The pain perception is a problem because we might injure people, but if we're aware of it, we can actually sometimes use it as a distractor. So engaging VR could be useful. For example, people post-stroke when they're or with musculoskeletal pain. We did some work with people with musculoskeletal pain with very slow walking. Immersing them in VR allowed them to walk faster without being afraid of the pain. Also, we talked briefly about shoulder injuries. Adhesive capsulitis, for example, requires treatment that's very painful and people don't want to engage with it. If we can put them in VR, then we can distract them from that pain and push them through to the point where we can do some therapeutically beneficial activities. Important if we understand some of these specific effects. I've named just 2 of them and there are many more, but we've started systematically looking at them, as have others, and trying to quantify them. So, for example, with visual flow, if I slow down the virtual camera to about half the speed that somebody's actually walking, we can get a 20% increase in walk speed, which I might not want in some clinical applications, but patients post-stroke, a 20% increase in walk speed is kind of the holy grail of how to get them back to community walking. So we can then leverage that by understanding not just that it happens, but precisely how it happens. The same with some of the audio. For example, we did some work, and others have done similar work. If you look at their baseline walking pace, their cadence, and then put an audio tempo that's about 25% above that as your background music, we we get a 15% increase in walk speed. Again, really useful if that's what we're trying to get. What we certainly don't want to do is we want people to slow down and walk a little more carefully or with a little more rhythm. So, we certainly don't have all the answers, but how do we go about finding out those answers or making better VR healthcare? And there isn't a simple answer, but there is an approach which I think people are starting to use, which is better. There are currently two main ways of approaching VR healthcare design. The first one, and this is pretty common, and there's nothing wrong with it, is that we identify a clinical need. So, for example, stroke rehabilitation. And we know what our rehabilitation outcomes are going to be. And it's a very clinician and patient-centered approach, which is good. And then a VR application is designed, it's often a particular task performance is designed in VR to simulate a task, and we evaluate it in terms of usability, acceptability, and efficacy. Does it work? And that is fine. There is nothing wrong with that approach. It's a very common approach, and there's been some good work done with that. There's an alternative approach, people coming from sort of what I sometimes do, where we look at the technical potential. We start understanding something about what happens with the hardware and the way people interact with it. And then we understand there are some behavioural modifiers that are possible because of the technology. This leads, so for example, in my PhD work, it made me realise that we could influence people's walking speed. This might have a clinical application, and from that we can start looking at VR applications that leverage that technical knowledge. And I'm generally then looking at designing the content, seeing how people perform in that content and how they interact, and does it get the specific behavioural modifier that I want. And again, nothing wrong at all with that approach. However, if we can put these two together and not just have a clinician and a technician working together, that happens a lot, but try and put those two bits of specialist knowledge together. So the people who really understand how the hardware and software can modify behaviour and perception, put those together with people who understand the clinical needs in a co-design process, then we can start not just to make a VR application that does a task, that does a job, but we can make something that starts to use those components, those pharmacy elements of VR, not just to do a job, but to do it better than we could do it in the real world. And that, for me, I think, is the goal of making VR for health better. Not just can it be used? Yes, it can. Not just can it be effective? Yes, it can. But how do we actually reduce the side effects and optimise the outcomes? And I think the approach is not just a clinical person hiring a technical developer, or a technical developer saying, I made a thing, I think it's useful for your patients, but going right back and understanding these two streams of knowledge that are complementary and both add in to optimise VR. And I suspect we're probably pretty much at the end of the time. Are we, Christoph?
If you like, it's fine.
Yeah.
If you would like to go for a few more minutes.
So I think probably for today, that's where I'm going to stop that. There's lots more I could say, but I want to make sure we've got a little bit of time for any specific questions in there. So as I said at the beginning, this is not about presenting my research. I've done lots of bits of research, but more about I'm passionate about making VR better in healthcare. So any questions you've got about that, I'm very open to thoughts, ideas, and also any specifics about any of the work we do. So, opening the floor.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was a fantastic talk. I enjoyed it a lot. Has anybody got any questions, please? I've got a question. So there are many technologies that you see in labs, but when it gets to the actual clinical practice, there's often a strong lag from the technologies getting there. Is there any experience you could share with us how to achieve impact with such VR technologies, what the challenges are, and maybe any lessons that you've learned on the way?
I think that's a really good question, because it's a really important one. I think it's really easy, as you say, in the lab, you know something works, you can try it out with patients, you know it can be effective, but translating that into the clinic can be really difficult. One of the issues is with the technology we use. In research, we tend to use high-end technology, things that simply wouldn't be practical in clinical settings. And I think it's important to be aware of that right from the start. So, for example, some recent work we did was, in its very early work, looking at the use of VR in people with severe visual impairments. we very deliberately looked at smartphone VR because it was no good knowing that it might have some benefits using very high-end VR if we wanted it to be able to be used at home. The same with our chronic pain management. It's no good using a fully tracked HTC Vive with full body optic tracking if I want people to use it 3 times a week at home. And so therefore the first thing is think about the accessibility of the hardware and software. More importantly, perhaps, is really understanding not just the clinical need, but what happens in those clinics. Things like knowing, for example, that actually clinicians, even changing batteries on pieces of equipment is often becomes a barrier to uptake of technology. If batteries run out, we haven't got any near, we won't use that piece of technology. So technology which requires maintenance or setup in any meaningful way other than just plugging in and recharging is often just put aside and put in a cupboard. And I've heard this a lot when I've visited clinical practice. Making it incredibly easy to use, incredibly easy to maintain, and also understanding the workflow or the therapeutic processes within those clinics. Where would it fit? Go and talk to people. I was really fortunate that I got funded by IQ and Set Squared to spend 3 months doing exactly that. It was actually for the Phantom Pain Project, going and visiting clinics, amputees, clinicians, and asking where this would fit. You know, it's all very well saying it would work, but where would it fit in clinical practice? And sometimes the answers are really surprising about where it might or might not fit and what the barriers are. So I think right from the conceptualization of a research idea, you should already be thinking about how that will be taken up in practice. Is it actually usable and feasible, rather than just is it a good idea? That is one of the biggest barriers, is that clinicians simply cannot do what you know would work really well.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. We've got time for one more question. One more question, anyone?
I've got a quick question, if that's okay.
Yes.
So you mentioned that music and especially tempo can change your actions in VR and things like that. Do you think something like procedural or generative music that's based on your virtual actions or your environment could be useful?
The short answer to that is absolutely yes. We already know that sound and environmental sound can have a huge impact. We also know that biofeedback type processes where an environment responds dynamically to a user's behaviour affects what they do. So the answer to that is, the short answer is yes, I think it would, and I think it's a really interesting area to explore. I think personalised and dynamically adaptive systems are a really interesting route to go to. But it's back down again to understanding what those are and finding, I think, setting up systematic experiments or getting technical people to set up systematic experiments and looking at how these things might change those behaviours and which behaviours they change will help us to not just kind of throw a pile of an ingredient in, but to know how much of that ingredient in what form to give at what time. So yes, very much so, and I think that's the way we're going, but understanding precisely how that works is something we need to study.
That's great, thank you.
I've just seen there's a quick question in the chat, if I can answer that one. What do I think about using augmented reality in healthcare, and how does it compare with virtual reality for engagement and minimising negative symptoms? Again, a really good question, and I think it's not a straightforward answer because augmented reality and virtual reality are very different technologies. Virtual reality is immersive, you're putting yourself into a completely different space, whereas augmented reality is adding things into the world. So the way we use them and the goals of using them are often very different. At the moment, augmented reality hasn't quite caught up with the trajectory of VR development, in as much as we saw quite narrow fields of view. Some of the registration of objects in the real world aren't quite there yet, but it's coming. And I think it will have very specific applications, but they will be different from VR applications. So I don't think one will supersede the other, but I do think there are branches of healthcare. So, for example, medical training is one which I think will benefit much more from, or as much from AR as it would from VR, whereas perhaps psychological therapies like PTSD may need immersive VR, but perhaps fears and phobias where we can overlay, for example, spiders onto the real world might actually have an advantage using AR, or at least a different approach. So I think it's down to understanding the difference between the technologies and therefore what different goals they can support clinically.
Wendy, thank you so much. That was really great. And I found it very, very useful. Thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you will also enjoy our future talks, which I will announce in a couple of weeks probably. So Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.